Welcome to Through the Lens of Christ, a podcast designed to have conversation about things that are happening in culture, questions that we may have theologically, and other questions that impact our day in and day out lives. Our desire is to be able to build these conversations and to be able to get us to critically think not just about the events that are happening, but how do we see these events through the lens of Christ. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope it helps you to critically think through issues in our lives.
Good morning. How are you both doing?
Good. Good morning.
Good, thanks. Good morning.
Good. So we're back together again, talk through Acts, and we're the text itself that we're looking at is the end of chapter 14. And Paul and Barnabas were on a mission trip, and they stopped at many places. We've talked through a lot of what they have seen and some of the miracles God performed, and many of the heart changes that got allowed to happen within each of these little towns, and some of the frustration and anger and persecution. And now they kind of wrap this up and talk about a little bit about the intention and purpose of the mission work, and the greater view of how we are in relationship together. So we'll talk through chapter 14, verses 21 to 28.
Okay, I will read. Verse 21. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples.
Very good. So
Yeah.
what if anything jumps out on that passage?
Overall, a lot of traveling around.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are not staying in one place. They're moving around and getting things done for the kingdom. I mean, other things. The time it seems like they're, I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it a little bit. They want to spend time with God's people.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing. They're spending time with God. I think that's perhaps a big takeaway, just going back through it again.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's the idea of they're making a conscious decision to be there, and they know they're being led by God to do these things, but their heart isn't just to finish the mission, right? Their heart is to be with people and to make sure, they go back through towns that they were beaten and kicked out of and screamed and yelled at, and they go back in there not because they're like, oh, God's forcing us to do this, right? It's more of, we should check on these guys, right? How do you think they're doing? And how do you, this is hard for them, and it's hard for us, but can't imagine how hard it is for them to see. And do you think those seeds took root? Do you think that, they're still growing in faith? Do you think they know how to grow in faith? And I think there's a genuine care for other people, specifically other believers. And they're trying to check in on them and help them, as the one verse says, to strengthen and encourage them, that how do we do this together? Yeah, I think that is the overarching point.
Mm-hmm. I think I was thinking about this a little bit after Sunday's sermon, and just thinking about it like yesterday, just a little bit. Tell me if you sense the shift. Ashley, you may not sense the shift because you're so young, but maybe Adam and I, because we're so old, and I'm really old, can sense the shift. My sense is that as the culture moves from being more of a Christian, what would you say, a Christian accommodating culture, would you say it that way, maybe, to more of an antagonistic culture to Christians. In the past, we've had less emphasis on Christian community. and more on doing the things you need to do in the culture to be successful and happy. So like seems like maybe there's been a formula and everybody just kind of follows the formula independently, and good things generally happen to believers. But that's been going away the last couple of decades. That's why I say, actually, I don't know if you can tell me what you think about this. I mean, your parents have experienced it. Maybe they talked to you about it or whoever. But the last couple or few decades in particular, and really more than that, if we really want to think about it, have been moving in another direction to where Christians are more alienated and they're having more difficulty. And maybe this is a reason that in the last 10 or 15 years or whatever, we seem to find or hope that Christians will find some good things in community. And we stress that a little more now than maybe it would have been stressed 20 or 30 years ago. Is that just, I know it's sketched out really quickly, but is that a thing, do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a thing. I think again, you mentioned it earlier, but the idea that Christianity was kind of a baseline not that long ago. And so the expectation was that you went to church, you generally tried, the golden rule was still a thing, right? You still tried to, the 10 Commandments, still most people knew at least 7 or 8 of them, right? It was like, okay, there's some kind of underlying morality that's still seen as being Christian based. But that's gone, right? That, and in a matter of you're talking decades, I'd say even in a matter of the last decade, right? That it's been extricated out of the culture, and now there's there's a individuality, and also we talk a lot about allies now, right? So even if you're not part of the things of the world, you need to make sure that you're accommodating to the things of the world and that you're being an ally to those things. But you better not be an ally to Christians, because that is a hateful, bigoted group of people, and we need to make sure that they're now facing oppression. And so whether or not those things are specifically said, I think you can feel the cultural shift in terms of what we see as important or not. And then you're right, the general frame of what is success has also changed, where being a Christian with Christian values and high ethics was something expected to get ahead, and now those things are also removed and not valued. So yeah, I definitely agree.
When
I
you
think
mentioned, oh, go ahead, Ashley.
I think you even see it more like in the last 5 or 6 years. Like you can see it in, I started at the church 6 years ago in children's ministry, and you can see the difference in the type of kids that we had that were new 6 years ago. The expectation was kind of, most of you know a pretty good amount of Bible stories, where now it's not like that. You can't expect that kids are coming in knowing most of those Bible basics. A lot of them have never even touched a Bible. And so it, even in the last 5 years, it's changed a lot too. And that need for, like Adam talked about on Sunday morning, that discipleship need to disciple and to be discipled is even more important today than it was. Not that it's always been important, but I think as more mature believers, it needs to be even more important to us that we're doing that.
Yeah, I think and perhaps one of the reasons that we're in the state that we're in, the churches and state that it's in right now, is that wasn't done for the last 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 years, right? So because of the leaning on the culture and the comfortableness with the culture, that perhaps believers didn't fellowship the way that they should have together, and just kind of thin relationships in a thin thing. You mentioned allyship too, Adam. I think the other thing that's happened too is there used to be one central unifying kind of framework for our culture, and now there's multiple frameworks that all ally together to make another unity. So it's a piecemeal approach to a structure is what we have today, and in the past it was unified under Christ in some way. It wasn't really Christendom, but it was more Christian focused. I think that's definitely happened as well.
Yeah. I think 100%. And I think Ashley's point about discipleship is well made. I think, and I don't want to indict any of these things, but like you look at the Billy Graham Crusades, they weren't focused on discipleship. They were focused on evangelism, right? And they had a huge impact on people. I think they were good. And I think people, in the 50s and 60s and there were clearly many people impacted. But I think what you see is that the Billy Graham Crusades didn't come back into town like Paul and Barnabas did. They didn't come back and say, hey, we care about the people. They just moved to the next place and expected that the local church would pick this up and that they would do something with it. And I don't think that happened. And then I think you had this massive kind of mega church movement coming out of like the late 70s into the 80s, where it was, hey, we just heard a revival message somewhere. We've got all these people that are coming into churches. Now it's our job to grow the church. And so we find a pastor to follow. And we have a lot of these kind of celebrity persona pastors, right? These big name pastors who had enormous churches, but discipleship didn't happen. And so we grew churches and it looked good and people nominally were Christian and, they heard some stories and, it seemed okay, but there just wasn't there weren't roots put down. So when that generation had kids, they didn't know what to do about it, right? And so to Ashley's point, they started taking them to children's church and somebody else will disciple my kids. And you take one more generation removed, which is where we're at. That's the kids coming in now. And, the kids that grew up just having a little bit of discipleship and just a little taste of something that my parents kind of believed in have just kind of rejected it, right? Or like, I don't know what to do with this now. And I don't know where this all fits. And I think it does go back to, we have a much bigger responsibility than just bringing the message. And I think like I said, the Billy Graham Crusades were good, right? They a lot of people heard Christ for the first time, and a lot of people had some level of openness. I think what Hebrews would say is that they tasted, right, but didn't fully experience. And I think that's the big difference, is that they tasted and then we never discipled. And then we wondered, we had this huge movement of Christianity. I think it was in the 50s where we put One Nation Under God, right? It was like that was this massive movement. And this is where our focus is, and not, 70 years later, we're removing all of those things because there was really no foundation. There was a swell, but there was never any discipleship with it.
Yeah, so in some way there's a Christian consciousness that was lost. And then on the other side of it, there was, and I think that's, of course, that's a societal shift like we've been talking. And then there's also the idea of experts and other people to do the things that we should do ourselves, which is, we're going to drop our kids off with you, Ashley, and let you teach them about Jesus, because we don't know how to do that ourselves. We really need an expert or someone that's been trained, or someone that's, maybe that feels that's their skill set or their, whatever they might be, their spiritual gift, if you want to call it that, to be able to do those things. And so we're going to let the experts do it. That's a worldly intrusion into our Christian lives. And we do that all the time. We invite the world in. So because it's the way the world works and we're in the world, we invite the world in different ways. And I think we should be careful about that. We should really focus on Christians first, especially with regard to relationships and advice and discipleship, and not let our children. I don't want to let my children to be discipled by unbelievers. Even if they're semi good-hearted, they have good advice, things, there's lots of good things that unbelievers can bring to the table, no doubt. But a Christian emphasis and a Christian, what would you say, a spiritual empowerment is not one of them.
Well, we talk about allyship. I mean, we're talking about discipleship, right? That the world is discipling our kids. And yes, we don't look at it that way, right? But they're being indoctrinated, they're being discipled, they're being told a message, and then they're being taught how to follow it. And that's exactly what we were given in the Great Commission to do. And we're failing to do it because we're putting it on other people. And we've talked as elders, like, we're talking about what do we do with the North Campus and how do we launch a school? And I think one thing that's important to us is that how do we make sure if we launch a school, we're not just providing another outlet for, kids to just be kind of dropped off for somebody else's care, right? But that we actually say, how do we engage family in this effort? And how do we make sure that parents are, both discipling at home and that we're discipling when we're there, and like building actually a holistic relationship rather than teaching kids that faith is compartmentalized. It is just a school thing. It is just a church thing. And then you have your outside world, which operates differently. And that's I think an image that we've given over the years. And we really need to get back to that Christ is in and through everything. And that's our school life and our church life and our home life and our personal lives.
No,
Yeah,
I think
I think about like even the way I was raised personally was church was being a Christian was you go to church on Sunday morning, you pray before dinner, and you go to Awana on Wednesday nights. And that was, I mean, that was the extent of it. And so even becoming like being raised in the church and then becoming a young adult in the church it was weird to me at some point to kind of finally have that acknowledgement of like, oh, I need to be in a small group and I need to make sure that my closest friends are the people who are going to point me towards Christ and give me Christ-like discipleship and advice when I ask for it. And I need to be spending less time on the internet and more time in scripture and more time just engaging with people who believe the same thing as me. Going to church on Sunday morning isn't enough to say, yes, I'm a dedicated believer of Christ. It's part of the role and it's part of the importance of being in community, but it doesn't encompass your whole discipleship.
yeah, I feel like you could have just followed the pattern in your life and done the same thing yourself and kept going to church, but you made a shift, like you just mentioned. That shift, if that shift isn't made, then my sense is that you live in nominal Christian world for the rest of your life, and you may end up finding out you never were a believer to begin with. And an unbelieving believer is the worst kind of person. They're the hardest to get through to, and they're the more difficult to deal with in their family situations and in the way they treat their spouses and their children and the way they operate their lives. They're in many ways worse than a completely secular person, statistically.
Well, and that shift wasn't
abuse-wise, all those things, right?
Yeah, and that shift wasn't, oh, I realize this now, I need to be doing all of these things. That was other more mature believers coming alongside me and saying, hey, are you a part of a small group? Are you doing these things? Are you, connected to different ministries? Are you engaged in serving and doing these different things? And I wouldn't have had that shift had those other people who knew and understood those things not discipled me along the way too.
Yeah. We would call that God's grace through others, right? Hitting you.
Yep.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as I get older, right, you parent kids, and I've parented kids over I'll be parenting for like 40 years, right? Based on how we spread our kids apart. Right. So you're kind of watching generationally, like kids being raised and how quickly things are changing and evolving. And I just look at when I first kind of was introduced to this integrated family idea, right? Meaning that, hey, your kids are with you and they're going to learn with you and they're going to be in small groups with you and they're going to be connected and they're going to, right? I rejected the idea. I'm like, no. Like kids are going to be bored, right? I mean, they're not going to like it. They're going to be a distraction. They're going to be, right? They're going to hear things they probably shouldn't. They're going to, and I'm not like fully pitching integrated family stuff. I just think that there is value in actually bringing kids along the journey with you. Like our responsibility is to both be changed by our children, right? We're being sanctified through parenting, but it's also that we're setting an example and we're introducing them into things that, we've for so long have been like, hey, groups are for adults and church is for adults. And then when kids become adults, they're like, well, I don't know what these groups are, and I don't know what this church is. And that's why we're doing a youth Sunday this coming Sunday, because we want to do more of those integrations with our kids into the body. I do think there's value in children's ministry. And I think Ashley and everybody that serves in our children's ministry does a really good job of trying to teach and train in a level that's appropriate for our kids. But I also think there's damage we've done by not pulling them into the larger church and not having them be a part of that group because we're worried that they might be bored or that we're worried that they might be a distraction or, right? It's just a very selfish view. And, I'm guilty of it. And I think that it's something that I've been convicted of over time is, often on Sunday mornings, my wife will bring the kids to the early service so that they can sit in the service. and then we'll bring them to Discovery Land for second service so that they can also hear something else. And that's, the kids don't want to go to two services. I don't want to be at church for 4 hours on Sunday morning. But I think there's good value in it. And I think we just need to start thinking differently, not just I went to church, but how did I disciple my kids, even in the act of going to church? And I just think we have to take on a different mindset.
Go back to your sermon. I mean, so we need to do that with our children, but we need to do that with ourselves too. So integrating our children into the difficulties of life. I mean, I'm more and more forced to do that, to be honest, but it's all good. We got the first 4 that were older, and the second 3, they're high schoolers in our house right now. And there's still stuff going on in the family with the older 4 that the younger 3, I'm not isolating them from that. They're integrated into that discussion. So they're old enough too. They're in high school, right? Which also goes to the point, you'd be amazed, or maybe you guys wouldn't be amazed, and many people would be amazed at what a high schooler can do. What they can listen to, what they can learn about, what they can engage in, and how they can participate in deep, thoughtful things. So often the church has been so lightweight in that area, middle school, high school, and given them fluffy little things to do that just, again, I feel like they turn out nominal. It's a nominal Christian factory, but they're able to think deep thoughts and get into deep conversations and start integrating their world in middle school and high school. And just, I think that was important part of your message last Sunday was us being able to disciple one another and being able to open up with one another. It's one thing to try to integrate all parts of our lives, but it's also something else to integrate parts of our lives in deeper ways and have an intentionality about that. And in my life, I don't know how you guys, maybe you guys could express this too, but I've found that verbal intentionality is critical. That I want to state what I want to do in this relationship. I want you to know me in these ways. And if you're willing, I'd like to know you in these ways, and we can help one another out. So it's one thing to just kind of be around Christians and feel like we can just absorb the aura, but that doesn't really work. I mean, that doesn't work that well. It actually takes words and intentions and someone to realize, to say over and over, you can do bad things to me and I still will not harm you, and I'm still going to be your friend. And then at some point over time, the other person actually believes those words.
Yep. Well, that's what I think.
You say it a lot, but over time then it's actually believed.
Yeah, I think that's why I love the last verse in there where it says they spent a long time with them, right? Because this happens over a long time. And we're in a culture where if something happens that I don't like it, I'm just going to leave, right? I'm going to head to a different church family. And sometimes it's good to leave the church, right? There may be heretical things happening, and right. But the idea of, hey, I'm in a Christ-centered body, and somebody did something to me I don't like, or the pastor said something I didn't like, or right. So now I'm just going to bail on that. It's like that. I just don't think that is what scripturally we're taught in terms of being a family together. And we have very thin Christian relationships, and so it doesn't take much to fall through the ice and throw them all away. And how do we strengthen that and build more depth in those relationships?
One of the things I told my older kids as they were leaving the house, I told them all the same thing. I'm like, well, you may have to move around a little bit early to find out where you're going to be and get a job that's going to be sustainable for your family. But once you find a spot, sit down and stay there. I mean, I moved around for 15 years, Danielle and I moved around for 15 or so years. We've been here now 23 years. And everybody's like, when are you going to come home? When are you going to come to St. Louis? Why don't you come to where we live? I'm like, no, I think I need to stay here. This is where I need to be. Now the Lord can do anything and change all kinds of things, right? But I intend to die here. I mean, I think about that in terms of missionaries. I think of missionaries that we send places where I get, you got to go back and forth sometimes. That's part of the thing. But where are we? If you really want relationship, it does, like you just said, it doesn't happen in 6 months or a year, and sometimes 10. I mean, living here, moving here to Southeast Wisconsin, I would say it took us a decade of kind of normal Christian. We didn't focus on it. A decade to feel real comfortable. I mean, now I've been here 23 years, and I'm like, no, I don't want to go through that again. I don't want to retire. Here's another thing. I don't want to retire and move to Florida or Arizona or what, right?
Right.
And start a life over again. So by the time I'm just about ready to get to the hospice care, I finally have some deep friendships. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that.
No, I mean we're transplants, right? We've been here for 18 years. And when, you know, and I think that's part of the cultural shift actually. Like when I started in my career 25 years ago, you retired with the company you started with, right?
Mm.
Like you went somewhere, you built a career there, you stayed there. That is not the way anymore. I think the average person now has over 10 different jobs, 10 different companies that you work for over the course of your career, right? And so there is this sense of, you know what, to get ahead, I need to keep moving and I need to keep bouncing around and I need to keep moving. And so culturally, we're drawn to all these different places, which are eliminating deep relationships. And so the deep relationships now happen in social media, which are not deep at all, right? They're just some level of random connection. And you, how do you build that deep connection? I mean, we've wanted forever to move back home. I miss my family dearly. We moved Jenny's parents out here a couple of years ago, but like I miss my family very much. And there isn't a holiday, an event, something that goes by that I'm like, I wish I could be with my family. But we don't have any expectation to move back home, right? We're like you were before. We were constantly looking for windows or doors that would take us back that way. And now it's like, no, he's put us here. And now we built strong relationships and strong roots. And you like it's just different. And I think understanding that we're called into places and being here for the long haul is good, not just for us, but for others around us, and building relationships and community. And it's good.
Good for the church.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're probably far out of time, but this is great conversation. I think again, hopefully the encouragement is that you know this idea of salvation is so individual and so unique, but yet it is so corporate and it is so community focused. And so he wants both of those things for us. And so you know, our prayer is that we would come into an individual, unique relationship with God through Christ, and that would draw us into a corporate experience so that we can be a family together. So I appreciate you guys and being family. So it is good.
It is good. Amen.
All right. See you later.
Thank
Bye.
you.